All right. Still morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I had so many notes that I had to start this conversation, and after the past few conversations, all of those notes have changed immediately. And so I want to start by thanking you, Komal, Cecilia, for bringing all of us together. I want to thank all of you in the audience for being here and sticking with us. And I want to thank all of the artists in the room the women artists, who have continuously put yourselves on the line in spite of a world that is increasingly violent against us, and been steadfast in your commitment, particularly the three of you who are on stage with me today. I want to start by thinking about something that Amy said about the three art world disruptors. And I realized one that you didn't mention, Amy, if you're still here, was scandal and violence, particularly around domestic and sexual violence and oppression against women's bodies. And then I realized, as Marilyn pointed out yesterday, that we are still in a time where that actually doesn't seem to matter in our world. And yet, in spite of that, so many of you in this room, including you three, continue to do that work in spite of that violence, to stand up, to put your bodies on the line in such vulnerable ways, and not ways that are purely vulnerable, but are empowering. So thank you for that. So I have a lot of questions, and we have a short amount of time. So I'm going to just jump into them, and I hope that everyone has done their homework on who these three legends are, because you are each legendary in your own right. But I'd like to start, if you could each, for as short of amount of time that we have, if you can each start by introducing your work, either in the context of this conversation, or, Joan, as you and I discussed before, in a sort of larger trajectory. As Komal mentioned, you have been working for several decades now, and not all of your work has been oriented in a specific style or aesthetic or modality of painting. And so I'm wondering if you can actually start us off by talking a little bit about the evolution of your practice, both as an artist and also as an educator.
To do.
I know, compound questions.
Well, I started out as an abstract expressionist, and in certain ways I suppose I am an unreformed one, just because of the way I like to handle paint. However, when I left this country for a period of about 7 years, and came back, I felt totally disassociated from the kind of work that was being done here. And I looked for a way to be able to work in a way that had meaning for me at the time. And so the work changed dramatically. And it was logical that it should change dramatically because my life changed dramatically. I became very involved with the women's movement in the early 70s when I came back to New York. And I met so many wonderful women artists, some of whom are still here with us and still friends. So that's was a very important marking point for me. And I looked for a way to reach the kind of people that I was involved with, and to make some changes in the way the world that I found myself in was treating women. And the women were of that period were all very, very active and all should have been in the mainstream of the art movement. Instead, they were either not being seen or they were completely isolated and in the men's world as minor artists. And that whole idea of women always being minor, always being auxiliary, I tried to figure out why that was happening and what we needed to do to change it and how I could do it in my own work. And so I moved into working with the body at that point. I came at it through sexuality. I was a woman of about 30 years old, just coming out of a bad marriage. Sexuality was very important to me, as it was to most women of those earlier ages. I say
And still is, yes.
Okay, of those earlier ages. And so I went for the sexuality. To go through to sexuality from a visual point of view immediately throws you into comparisons with pornography. So I had to deal with what did I really think about pornography. And I wondered why it was so abhorrent to most women and to me. And how would my work be different from that? So I tried to do things that would make the work very clearly art rather than pornography. And I did that by using the abstract background that I had in terms of dealing with color. And color for me was a real pleasure and a very important part of the work. So I did that just for a few years and then needed to move on. In order to move on, I needed to find something that would work as a continuity from the work that I had been doing, but something different, because I couldn't just keep working with the sexual theme. And so I not automatically, but gradually turned toward my own relationships and my own self. And I tried to figure out why I was who I was. Why did I lack confidence in certain things? Why did I worry about how I looked? Why did all of the things that made me a very successful female at that point made me a very unsuccessful civilian rebel? What was it that I needed to do to change myself? So I started from myself. I thought, well, if I worked from where I was, I would reach other women. And that was the beginning of my use of the self-image. Now, my self-image have been very well known and very often classified by art historians as self-portraits. And they're not self-portraits. They're not about me as a person. They're about how one understands one's own body and how one can inhabit one's own body in a way that is complete, that encompasses one's physicality, encompasses one's sexuality, and encompasses also one's vulnerability as a strength, not necessarily as a problem. So that was the beginning of my work.
Well, you basically answered all of the questions that I had, so I guess we'll just end the conversation there. I'm just kidding. Thank you so much for that. I think it's really important for all of us to acknowledge that the artist practice is never holistic or simply linear, that there is so much beyond what we may see or know canonically or within sort of the public sphere about the practice. I had the same question for the two of you. If you could talk just a little bit about sort of the context of your work, or I'm sorry, about your work within the context of this conversation about the body and sort of where that drive and desire comes from. And we'll just go down the line.
Everybody can hear me? Yeah, okay. It's so interesting because listening to Joan speak, I saw Joan's work in person for the first time in 2014 as part of Robert Gober's exhibition at MoMA, The Heart is Not a Metaphor, and seeing her work for the first time was totally transformative for me. And Julia Kristeva said, looking is the beginning of freedom, or looking can become freedom. And I felt like Joan's work gave me permission to investigate sexuality in the body in the early phases of my work from grad school onward. And for about 2 years, I focused primarily on my own body and representation of the body. And as I continued, I wanted to move from representing pleasure, so to speak, and into developing a pictorial logic that was more informed by building bonds and bridges with the viewer through language. And I think as my work has progressed, it's led to more of an interest in the way each artist actively constructs a very specific language, which I think only they can speak, but which many people can understand. And I think in my own work, I've been more interested in the language of painting, and that's sort of how it's evolved and all.
Thank you.
For me, I would say that I really identify with what both of you have said about like the significance of the body, and also this idea that there's something that is of us that's outside the body or apart from the body that inhabits it. So for me, I've really just been investigating since the beginning of my practice, like primarily what the like kind of iconographic significance is of the body. I think that the body functions as a symbol oftentimes, especially when it's a body that is othered. If it's a female body, if it's a black body, if it's a queer body, it becomes to have a meaning for people that is apart from what the real journey and mission of that individual is. And I've been trying to unpack personally what the symbolism is that's associated with various bodies and how it's used in the greater cultural context. So sometimes I'm borrowing some of these tropes, like manipulating them. Ultimately, I'm trying to change them and kind of create a language or create new symbols or understandings for the body that I think are more true and more earnest and more in line with this aspect or essence that inhabits the body, which I think is a consciousness, which I think is a soul. So oftentimes, there's many existential concerns that come into my work. And primarily, I show the body as being pure material, because I think that it is a material, and in it being a material, it can be manipulated, and it can be changed, and ultimately, it's not real. It will kind of disintegrate. So the real value of a human being is beyond that. So those are the main missions in my practice.
Thank you. And Shaba, I want to stick with your work for a second in the ways in which your figures occupy space and the way in which you use various materials as well as humor to occupy space. I think your work touches on not just, as you mentioned already, the female body, but sort of the intersectional body and the ways in which an intersectional body, particularly one that's so visibly intersectional, occupies space. Can you talk about the way in which you intersect materials in that work, and also integrate humor as a way to create these archetypes and take up space?
Well, I've always wanted to find a way to paint that really reflected the conceptual concerns in my practice. And it actually took me like a really long time and a lot of experimentation, like formal experimentation, to develop a like pictorial language, like Ambera was speaking about, that like reflected my intentions. So when I think about a person or personhood or identity even, I feel like it's an accumulation of many different aspects. So you have aspects of yourself that are inherent, but many things that become part of you are projected onto you or become attached or acquired throughout a lifetime. So basically the patchwork or the accumulation process through the collage and the textile collage was a way for me to like visually speak to this phenomenon and have it be embedded in the physicality of the artworks. So there's like a marriage between the conceptual and formal aspects of my practice. And just working in this way was the easiest way for me to communicate this, I guess, metaphorically. The other thing is that in graduate school, there was a lot of conversations about deconstructing painting, the decolonization of painting, because a lot of people believe that painting is very much like a European, Western way of participating in the pictorial space. And I think that a lot of times people forget that the ultimate substrate, the ultimate foundation of painting is textile. So me kind of cutting into the canvas itself, rearranging the canvas itself was another formal gesture to have this conversation about deconstructing painting without it becoming like overly didactic. So that's kind of how I landed on my process.
Thank you. And I think as an aside, you touched on something that is very important to me within the sort of larger vernacular of painting education, which is how it's always so Eurocentric, with the idea that painting emerged and evolved out of the West when it in fact did not. And there's a very long legacy well beyond the Western canon of that I think you look at, that so many artists look at, and we often leave them out of the conversation as well. Sticking with material and manipulation of material, Ambera, there's a visceral, almost excessive, painterly excess in your work. The body becomes a site of sensation as much as representation. How do you think about this relationship between the material and what you are depicting within the site of the body? And also, sorry, one more sort of adding to that, and your sort of physical act of painting.
There are a lot of moments in my paintings where the paint is built up into this thick, sort of excessive impasto. And
It's like icing.
Pardon me? Oh. Oh, is this okay? Yeah. This is so awkward. Okay. I think that I'm very interested in creating a sort of infinite visual loop in my paintings. I think that composition has the capacity to unrepress things in a picture. And I'm not interested in controlling like a story from beginning to end and looking at a painting. And the material quality of the paint operates inside of this sort of rhythmic or melodic loop that I'm trying to create. And these moments of impasto coexist with moments of aggressively erased paint. And I'm interested in these like internal cycles inside the painting way more than I am interested in definitive subject matter and or narrative or storytelling, which I think sort of control the work in a way that I'm not interested in.
In spite of them having a very narrative
Some of them
quality to
yeah,
them.
maybe.
And I just want to stick with this. You talked about erasure a little bit. Is that purely a part of the making process, like the act of erasing, or is there a broader sort of metaphorical aspect of that you're thinking about as you're making?
It's, it's a gesture that is like a lack of control over the painting. It is, when I'm erasing something, I have so much doubt when I'm painting, so much frustration, and I've said many times I hate painting because it's so hard. It's like the bane of my existence a lot of the time, and the erasure, those moments come out of having spent a long time on something and, have it be wrong or have it feel wrong. And the mechanical gesture of eraser is this moment where my intentions sort of disappear from the work and it becomes something that I couldn't have done myself. And I think it's very interesting to absence yourself from the work in that way and have it sort of take on an autonomy of its own.
Thank you. Joan, I'm trying to figure out which question to ask you because you have your life as a painter and also as an educator, which are not mutually exclusive by any means. And I'm trying to decide if I should ask you which path I should go down. I guess I'll ask you another two-parter. So many viewers talk about the intimacy of your paintings. The intimacy of your paintings. How do you balance intimacy with critical distance, both within your individualized painting practice, but also as a lens that you have used in educating so many generations of painters as well? I know it's a compound question, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm just going to talk.
Okay, just talk. I love it when you just talk.
First question is, so, oh, all right. So, for me, the painting has been the center of my life. Education was something I had to, in terms of educating other people, was something I had to do to earn a living. I like teaching, but I was very happy to be freed from it in the year 2000 and haven't gone back until, except in moments like this, right? So that's part of it. But it's very hard to dissect the separate parts of your life and say, I did this and that and that. It was all happening at the same time. And I didn't pull myself apart into pieces to say I'm this or I'm that or I'm the next thing. So it was a coherent experience, one of sexuality, love, children, fighting with people for your place in the world, thinking about what's going on in the world and what of it was really relevant to you and how you could make it work better for everyone. And those were the things that drove me through those years. And the tools that I used were my art to pacify myself in terms of making myself happy, but also to reach out to make the world understand what it was that I wanted from them and that I was going to give to them. And that was the process of making art at that time as a young woman. Right? What I did was I moved from one kind of work to another kind of work, which was always very shocking to everyone. How could you do that? I did that because my life changed enormously. The changes were gradual. They were always determined by other things that I was interested in. So when I went to a gym, I looked around and saw people in the gymnasium and thought, well, how is that relevant to what I'm interested in saying in the world? And so it tapped in to my critique of narcissism in the culture. And then the mirrors that were everywhere tapped into my frustration with always having to say, how do I look? always having to look in the mirror before I walked out the door, always knowing that those were the images that were the most important in telling people who I was. Nobody ever wanted to know what I thought. Nobody wanted to know what I had to say. All they wanted to know was, how did I look, right? And that was something that I was working against also in the paintings. But the paintings are about looking. The paintings are about seeing. How do you make other people see? How do you make other people look at themselves and think? Those are the things that I worked for in my work. And then we could dissect piece by piece what happened in each thing.
This wasn't a question we discussed before, but something you said it brought it up for me. Do you think in your prolific career, have you noticed a genuine shift in people's interest in hearing what you have to say?
Yes, unfortunately, they want us to talk too much.
Okay, well, I guess I'll move on then. Well, I suppose a better way of asking that question is, do you feel that anything has changed with relationship to artists, or maybe speaking just for yourself, who are women artists who are depicting the body? Has something shifted over the decades that is perhaps not necessarily positive,
Well,
but more nuanced?
It's hard for me to say because I'm not as connected now in terms of seeing a lot of the new work that's coming out. Just my age, I'm not able to get around as much. So I don't see as much. So I can't really comment too much on what other people are doing. There has been, the problem is, I think to some degree, that the art world is a place that deals in sections, you know, in the sense that it takes on a certain topic for a certain time and period of time. And so suddenly there's a lot of interest in the body because a lot of interest in the body is getting out there, right? Which stimulates other people to do it. What their motives are and what their images look like are not always relevant to the way I feel, but most likely has to do with the way they feel. And I think that the way women feel about their bodies have changed, but sometimes I think about what hast thou wrought, you know, that the changes follow so much of what the culture still gives us. And it still gives us certain attitudes about how a woman should look. And that still is the most important thing. And how she should look is a way that fashion, advertising, movies, and art tell her to look. And that's the problem. Because we take our sense of ourselves from all of those elements of the culture. And if that culture is corrupt, as it usually is, we become corrupted. And so that's a problem.
I agree. I think in thinking about the culture around us and both historical and contemporary context, Shaba, I want to ask you actually a sort of a question in a similar vein about how you're borrowing from history or not, or confronting it, but also to what Joan said in thinking about sort of a corrupt culture around us, how you think about that, if you think about that in the creation of your work and the bodies within your work.
I would agree with Joan that, I've been born and raised in America, so I can only speak confidently about this cultural experience, but I would say that there is a lot of corruption and a lot of perversion in terms of images that exist within the American visual landscape. And I do feel like all people who are made to feel marginalized in the social context are the ones that usually feel the brunt of that corruption. And I feel like, though, most people are passive observers in life. So when they're given any kind of messaging, they are not consciously able to register whether or not that message is true or false, for one, and then also if it's negative or positive. So I think that a lot of people just accept information, and it just kind of penetrates their mind and their psyche, because they're accepting the information as being neutral, regardless of whether or not it is in reality. So as an artist, I like to deal with this cultural material, this cultural output, and despite my own personal opinions, I do treat the material itself as relatively neutral and as simple material when I'm bringing it into my practice. But from that point, though, in using the material, I try to kind of build with it, deconstruct it, reconstruct it in ways that I can build narratives that I do believe are truthful, and I do believe are real, and I do believe are positive, and for my personal and everyone else's collective greater good, and for everyone's elevation, essentially. So again, because my subject is the Black female body primarily, I deal with a lot of material that I think deals with the significance and the symbolism that's associated with the Black female body. I think that there is a duality that exists, especially with that body. There's this kind of a rejection, a repulsion, but also this extreme comfort and reliance upon. So it's interesting that it kind of, all the different associations exist on this spectrum that are essentially on either end, they're nearly opposites. So it's really a lot of material to deal with, but it's a lot of material, it's also a great responsibility as well. I don't like to use the language that I'm uplifting the image or restoring the image, because I think that takes a position that I'm assuming that I've kind of already conceded to the degradation of the image, which I don't personally believe in. But for me, it's just about building things and structures and images and narratives that are real, ultimately real, not real in this moment in time or not real in this cultural context, but ultimately timeless and true and a more of a moralistic perspective. So that's kind of where I'm at this point in my practice.
I have a very quick follow-up question, which is, you said when you bring the materials into the work, they're neutral, or you consider them to be neutral. How do you get to the point of neutralizing them, or what's the process to neutralize them?
Well, I don't personally consider them to be neutral, but I treat them with a sense of neutrality, because I think that's how they are treated in reality. I think most people don't fully investigate or understand a lot of the images or messages that are projected onto them. I think they just accept them. And when you just accept something without questioning it, you're not really attaching any kind of value to it. You're just kind of letting it just seep into your mind. So I think that's kind of a neutral gesture, because you're not making any kind of decision. You're just kind of accepting things as they are. So I treat the materials, I think, similarly to that, as something that just exists. But in doing that, I think I have more freedom in building new narratives that are parallel to. Because I think if it's a corrupted narrative, sometimes it's better to, instead of trying to fight the narrative, which already exists as an energy and force in the world, you can build a parallel one that is, I think, on the right track, that's fresh and correct on a strong, psychological and emotional foundation. So I'm trying to use all these materials that I feel like I've absorbed, my peers have absorbed, everyone that's lived and grown in the society have absorbed, and kind of just use them to build new narratives that are real narratives that I think are speaking to an ultimate truth about what the female experience is, what the intersectional female woman experience is. And I don't know if I've been successful in that goal, but it's my life practice at this point, and it's something I'm working towards.
Thank you. Am I on time? Okay. I have so many questions. Okay. So, God, I hate having so many questions. Okay, specific question for you. Historically, in Western art history, the body has been central to painting as a genre, somewhat. What interests you about returning to the tradition of body, but also not all of your work incorporates the body or the human body? And so can you talk a little bit about the importance of the human form, but also other forms in your work as it sort of enters into a realm of surrealism as well? Not surrealism with a big S, but a surreal quality.
I mean, the body has just always been so important to painting. I think it always will be. For me, I want to see like the indexical sign of a person processing thoughts, you know, to almost like touch on what Shaba said. It's like images come to us so quickly and we're so inundated by them, they move at the speed of thought. And I think painting allows us to perform images, and by that I mean it allows us to experience them as a time-based experience again, as opposed to instantaneous. I think it helps us register them and process them, evaluate them. And my work, you know, feels unstable and amorphous because I don't think we have a stable understanding of what the body or what humans are. And I have used substitution. Oh my God, sorry, I'm trying to get the hang of this. I have used substitution a lot in my work and use animals or objects in place of humans because they create a pathway for us to, I think, for relationships that sometimes a definitive body cannot. And like I use animals a lot in my work because I find we have empathy for animals in a way sometimes that is a more open or trusting place than anything else. And I mean, even when I was in grad school, I was using inanimate objects in place of humans, just to cultivate this broader sense, or this more openness, I suppose, to empathy in painting.
I'm so glad you brought up empathy right at the end of our time. And now I want to ask all of you in the very few short seconds that we have left about the political implications of your practices, or if you consider that your practices have intentional, politically catalytic aspects to them.
Politically what?
Catalytic. So something that sparks a social or socio-political conversation simply by the fact that you are depicting often, or in your case, almost always, female bodies. And is there a sense of responsibility or obligation in having a political conversation? Anyone can start. I saved the easiest question for last.
Well, I think that that everything is political, so I wouldn't separate it that way. It's just like I feel very often the focus on, quote, the body is deformation of the intent of the artist. It tends to take it out of the realm. It formalizes it in a way that de-emotionalizes it. It's very difficult, for instance, for in this culture to acknowledge the body as the person. What is a body without it being a person? People ask me that about my paintings, that it's a body without a head. Why do we have a body without a head? Because I'm trying to make people feel that body as part of their person, right? And so that in that way, that can animate it and make it dynamic for them. And I think that the political is in almost everything we do, even though we don't realize it. The way women are educated, not only women, but across the board, everyone. The way women are educated, they're educated to take certain roles in society. So if we're trying to function in any way outside of those roles, it's immediately a political position that they're taking. But the government also takes a political position when it eliminates the possibilities for women to get educated. And that's what's happening now. So I think we're all in a bind. We all have to be political. Otherwise, we're all lost.
Thank you.
I mean, I would agree with Joan that every aspect of life is political. But I would also say that to say that the body is solely political, I think is almost a reduction of it. I think that the body is something that, like, that it's what all, it's the foundation of human experience, because every human being, like has a body. And this, like, it becomes a vehicle in which you navigate the world, you navigate your entire life through. And I think that when people lose sight that someone's body doesn't speaks to their own individuality, their human experience, their one life, and they try to, like, prevent people from having access to certain things, or they're being made to be treated differently or experience certain violences as a result of their physicality, that crime is worse than just a political crime. It's a crime against humanity. It's a crime against I think, just it's an existential crime. So that's why it's even more relevant, and I guess in the secular sense of it being political, it's even more offensive in that regard, because I think cosmically is offensive. So, yeah.
Last word.
Yeah, last words, no pressure. Yeah, it is, I think, it's impossible for it not to be political as long as we are making work and operating under a regime that oppresses women and queer people and people of color. Our gestures are political. I don't think even a choice to be apolitical is a political choice. That's right. There's no way out of that. And so I do feel a responsibility, but I also feel like in the midst of that responsibility, it's important, especially in the studio, to feel free, to do what you want, and to feel liberated, and not let that huge responsibility obstruct you from feeling creative, because the pressure of it is a lot as well. But I think artists have a responsibility to acknowledge the circumstances under which they're making art and balance and navigate that with a sense of liberated creativity and freedom.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Please.
I just wanted to amend something, because I agree. I agree totally with what you just said, and I wanted it to be understood that because I speak politically doesn't mean that I go into the studio and when I'm working, I'm thinking about making a political statement. I'm working as a painter, as an artist. What I'm interested in is that I make a work that resonates, that when you see it, you feel something. When I see it, I have to feel something. And there has to be that moment when the work stands independently of anything else and just holds the viewer, whomever that viewer might be. And as an artist, you know when that happens. You know when your work speaks to you. And when it speaks to you, it will speak to somebody else. But when you are trying to make it a work of propaganda only, you lose yourself, you lose your work, and you lose your audience, you know.